Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As always, we thank you for joining us on this literary journey across the Caribbean. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing renowned author Olive Senior on her latest novel, Paradise Once. Thank you for joining us, Olive.
Thank you.
It is our pleasure once again. So, I suppose we could begin with the setting of the novel. Why did you choose Cuba for this novel?
Okay, I describe this in an author's note in the book because I made many, many attempts to write this novel, mostly set in Jamaica, where I'm from. But it was as if a particular incident in the um, events that in the so-called, let us say, discovery by Europeans. A particular event that's narrated by Las Casas stuck in my mind. And this was a massacre in a Cuban village, an unprovoked massacre of the entire village by Spanish forces. And it was as if the ghosts of those people are calling to me all this time and saying, you have to bring us back to life. You have to write the story of this. And so the book is set in Cuba because it begins in that village with that massacre. It doesn't really matter in a way because the culture I'm writing about was similar in all the islands of the Greater Antilles.
And as you mentioned, the author's note, I am referencing the author's note here where you say that you had to yield to those voices, that once you heard them, once you took them up, you couldn't put them back. And the only
Mhm.
release was to answer the call. And so we noticed that there are so many characters and multiple perspectives, and the shifting between these characters with these different perspectives. So I was wondering if you could tell us about how you maintain the balance in the narration, in the narrative, amongst all of these moving parts.
Yes, in fact, the most difficult part of writing this for me was deciding on the structure, how to tell a story, because this story has lived in my head for many, many, many years, and I've come to know the characters and so on. But how to tell the story really was very difficult, and it ended up that I had to create that village setting because that is a center. What happens in that village is what triggers all the action in the story. But also, with this book, I also wanted to present the reader with a version of the world of these indigenous people that we have not really seen. This is not the world that has been presented to us in our history books. In my time, we were told that they were these primitive little people that Columbus met and they vanished. End of story. Later history books, yes, do give us more information. But it's only now that we're recognizing, because there's been so much research in the last maybe 3 decades, 4 decades, that we're coming to a much better understanding of who these people were. So I felt that part of my mandate was to present the Taino as we imagined they were, and that meant creating a village scenario. So the first section of the book is set in a village, and I do apologize to readers because it's people. There are a lot of people there. Please don't try to remember everything. It's like you walking into a strange village, you meet some people, you notice their interactions and so on. But the purpose of that is to introduce you to the Taino and their way of life. Once we get over that section, then there I'm following the survivors of the massacre, who are the real heroes of the story. There are four young people who set off on separate paths, and two medicine men, two shamans, who are shadowing them. And so we're getting these different stories, but it's much easier to follow the individual stories after that. And what I've done, instead of following one individual all the way through, I stopped that person's narrative at a critical point. So you'll want to go back to it. Then I switch to another reader and so on. But my I did want to show the life of a tiny village in the first part of the book.
And I want to pick up there in terms of the Taino village and this particular community. So this is a first contact novel, uh, but the first contact was between the Spanish and this particular community of Taino people. But we know that the Spanish had already gained a foothold in the Caribbean. Um, but the community that you referenced in this novel were able to avoid such contact because of their isolation in the mountains. Why did you want to explore what first contact looked like in these particular circumstances?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think first contact is a bit of a misnomer because once contact was made, the effects are reverberating up to our present moment. This is how I think about it. But in practical terms, yes, the first contact was in Puerto Rico, and then the Spaniards moved to the other islands, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Bahamas, and so on. And Cuba, where my story is set, was the last of the islands to be conquered in that way and to be settled and to be overrun. And so my story is set about two generations after what we're calling first contact here, after 1492. And one of the things I wanted to show was how much devastation took place just within two generations. Um, so that is why we're seeing these people in a way just having their first contact. This is the first time they are meeting the Spaniards, but they have been hearing all about them all along from the very beginning, because these islands were connected, by boat. There were um, interconnections through trade and so on. So news traveled very fast among the islands. So the people in this village had heard about them and were conflicted, as were all the Taino, in terms of the news that they'd heard. Do we welcome them? Should we be afraid? Should we be welcoming? And so on. So I try to capture that as well.
To sort of follow on from that question, you describe the experience of exploring the myth of the Taino extinction as an uncovering or a revealing of that which already exists. And I must admit that it has been a revelation for me in terms of the details of everyday life that you provided, right?
Mhm.
But so my question is then, what audience did you have in mind for this novel?
Yeah. Well, you know what? When I write, I never have an audience in mind. Because I think I'm writing the human story. So it's whatever I write, I throw out there for whoever wants to relate to it. But this particular story, I sort of would like it to be a learning experience for people, especially those of us in the English speaking Caribbean who are not at all conscious of our or are not conscious enough of our indigenous ancestry. And so I hope it will be a learning tool in that respect. But I didn't write it just for this audience, for this readership, because one of the things that bothers me is that indigenous people in the Americas we've seen this uprising in the last, couple of generations with indigenous people affirming themselves, reclaiming their identity, especially say in Canada where I am now. And I'm a little disturbed that the very first people who bore the brunt of this contact with Europe are sort of written out of that narrative. They're not being, not just the Taino, but indigenous people from the so-called Carib or Kalinago, the people of Trinidad, Guyana, and so on, are written out of this history. So yeah.
I actually wanted to pick up on that because, interestingly, I only did Caribbean history in secondary school 10 years ago, for context. And the, there wasn't really a connection in the teaching between the indigenous people and the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans. And it's only now that in this conversation, I'm starting to think of it, and that we never really were taught of the connection. We were just taught, okay, indigenous people were here, there was genocide, and then life went on, but we never really got the connection. And so, I
Mhm.
actually wanted to address the other aspect of first contact that you mentioned in your novel, the first contact between the Taino people and an enslaved African. Why did you want to highlight that in particular?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point because I'm bothered by the fact that certainly in Jamaica and maybe the other islands, we think of history either as 1492 and this Colombian encounter, or in the case of Jamaica, 1655, when the island was taken by the British. And of course, that introduced the period of plantation slavery. This is how we conceptualize our history. It totally ignores that much longer connection with the indigenous, but also the fact that enslaved Africans were being brought into the Caribbean from the 16th century, which is the case of the African in my books. I really wanted to make that point. First of all, it showed that the population in Puerto Rico, the island of first contact, was already so decimated that they had to then bring in a workforce from Africa as early as that. Um, so we need to then rethink the introduction of Africans into the Caribbean. Also, I wanted to make the connection between the indigenous and Africans in terms of a creation of maroon societies. Because the first Maroons were a mixture of those two people fleeing to the mountains to create a resistance, to the Spanish and later the English and Dutch and French, whatever occupations. So I'm trying in the novel to cover those elements of history that we have tended to ignore. So thanks for bringing that up, Roger.
Yes, and I have a question here related. Because through reading it, I kept thinking that this novel serves it's undertaking an urgent project of counter memory and counter history, and I am getting the sense that based on what you're saying, this was your intent as well. If you would say a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, because of course, the histories that we have been taught up to recently were written by the conquerors. Um, they're written from the perspective of the people who settled um, and instituted colonial power on these societies. And what is happening now is that I regard my novel as part of a whole movement all over the world for the people who, whether they're indigenous, African, we're seeing it everywhere, where people now want to reclaim that history and write it from a different perspective, from our own perspective. And this is just happening everywhere. We can see it. So I see this novel within that context, but I would go further and say that I am using historical research to create a world that I'd like to feel is authentic as we can make it. But at the same time, as a novelist, I have an advantage over the historian, where I can take liberties in bringing the story to life, because I'm creating characters, I'm creating a narrative, and so on. And I also want to say that I took the choice to tell a story not from the perspective of Olive Sr., but from the perspective of the Taíno people themselves. That is a point of view in the story. It's a point of view of the Taíno characters, but also of Saku, the African, when we switch to his point of view. So it is a counter narrative in all of those senses.
And then I suppose I could ask if this is what went into the title of the novel, because we often ask authors about the title
Yeah.
of their books, and some say the publishers chose this, or this was my deliberate choice. So I was wondering whether Paradise Once was intentional.
Yeah, very much so. Because Columbus and the other conquistadors always said that the Caribbean islands were paradise. And if you think of it, they were in the sense of climate, in the sense, certainly, the Taíno heartland had no food scarcity as far as we know. There was an overabundance of food, land, both in the land and the sea. They had yucca, cassava, as their main crop. They had no threatening land animals in these islands, and no real threats from external enemies. We're told that the cannibal, Caribs were threatening and so on. But that threat was, from what we can see, quite limited. And in fact, there were exchanges, trade exchanges, and so on. So these environments, for hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of years, were peaceful, had food abundance, so that enabled people to create societies, that were at peace, that were paradise. Even our looking back at them can say that. And so I deliberately chose the title Paradise Once, because the question is raised in our mind now, is that, are we still paradise? Did this, and of course, the people promoting tourism would want us to believe that, but we could argue against that. And part of the anti-paradise argument really is the destruction of the environment, which has taken place ever since 1492 and continues today. And this is the exact opposite of how the indigenous people were. They were custodians of the environment, and the lives they lived saw no difference between the humans and nature. There was that respect and interaction and that caring for the environment, which contributed to the idea of a paradise. Um, so yeah, I also wanted that then to raise questions in people's minds and to make connections with our contemporary world.
Yeah, and I think it's effective in that way, and in other ways as well. Other ways I one of the other features of the novel that I feel stand out a great deal is the power of naming, and
Mm.
it's one of the many ways power operates. But
Mhm.
I wanted to hear from you. For example, when you have the main characters that speak about it, they're careful in naming, they're careful in giving their names, and for example, Shark Tooth with the crocodile shaman and Siboney being an insulting term for the old one, something I was not aware of. So could you say a little bit more about how the power of naming as it operates in the novel?
Yeah. Well, the power of naming is powerful in many everywhere. In fact, the missionaries who came to the Caribbean and were mentions this in relation to baptisms and how anxious people were have a change of name, and many people wouldn't give their names because many cultures believe that to know someone's name is to have that person in your power. And the indigenous people were no different in this respect. So no, you were never told, you never shared your real name that was given to you at birth. And you also acquired a number of names as you went through life to signify, different aspects of your development and so on. So I wanted to capture that whole idea of names and naming, but it's not just a feature of the Taino. In fact, I think of Jamaica today and how so many people, you see reports in the newspaper of, say, people wanted, criminals wanted by the police, and every single one of them already has many aliases. Or you look at sports figures or people in entertainment and how very few of them use their real names. They assume names that refocus or idea on their power and or what it is that they have, that they are giving, what is emanating from them. So I think that's a part of our society even today, but I did want to capture that as part of Taino society.
And going back to your research for this novel, and the huge amount of research that went into it, I also assume that there were gaps. So, did you think of your approach to Paradise Wands as critical fabulation at any point?
I love that term. Yeah, and let me say, I didn't set off doing research to write a novel. I set off doing research to find out for myself who these people were. And I've continued this for I can't tell you how many decades. And I've actually written a lot of poems where I've used Taíno mythology and so on. But I just got to a point where I said, oh my God, what am I going to do with all this stuff? And I said, okay, I have to write a novel. So when I came to write the novel, I was saturated in the society. I had been thinking about um, the characters and so on. So the point is that the Taino left very little information about themselves in terms of language and words. We only have that through their mythology, which was told to us a priest. And a Cuban scholar in recent times have sort of reinterpreted that for us especially in relation to their art and artifacts and the world of the semis and so on. And because they left nothing, they didn't leave us much in terms of hearing their voices. A lot of what we know about them is coming to us through the Spanish chronicles, through their art and their artifacts, and so on and so forth. So there are gaps. And what is amazing is that how modern technology has opened up so much more of this world to us. It's amazing how much scientists and historians and archaeologists can tell us, but there are gaps. And so this is where I, as the fiction writer, have the advantage over the historian because the historian has to stick to the facts. I can take liberties. I've tried to remain as true as I can to the facts, but there are things we simply don't know. So what I did was I looked at similar cultures in the area from which the Taino are supposed to have originated. That is in this Orinoco region of Central America, around Colombia, Nicaragua, etc. That area, Venezuela, and of course there are living indigenous people in Guyana, Suriname, and those places as well. So if I needed to find out something specific, I looked at those cultures. I was researching them anyway as part of trying to understand this world that Columbus entered. And so there are some specifics in my novel where I can't say this was Taino, but the chances are that this is how it operated there. For example, the girl is seeing her first menses. This is night orchid, and she's put into a little hut to protect her from the sun, and she stays in darkness for the duration of her bleeding. And then at the end, she has a grand coming out. The whole society welcomes her. I can't say this was specifically Taino, but it is very specific to many, many, many of the cultures of indigenous tropical America. And so I felt comfortable doing that. So I didn't take liberties with things that were extreme or make up anything from out purely out of my imagination. I drew on what existed as similar practice in nearby cultures. And in fact, there are a lot of things that are very similar throughout indigenous cultures everywhere, too.
The text does well to emphasize the importance of communal living, so much so that the self interested actions of some of the characters tend to lead to disastrous consequences. Could you say a little bit more about the importance of the community, the coming together of the different, especially after the disaster of Maima, the sense of needing community, needing to come together in order to endure?
Yeah, because my impression is that these are well ordered societies with rules, and regulations and so on. And this kind of society is only possible when you live in the kind of paradise I've described. You're settled so you can develop order. And so everyone's life is regulated from birth for the good of the community, you know. And so I tried to capture that and capture some of the rules because, for example, um, there was reciprocity between male and female. So women had power too in different ways from men. Women and men had very switches, etc., etc. Children were raised a certain way, and had their coming of age, where you became a man or a woman according to rules laid down, and all of these rules went back to what they call first time, and the mythologies. It's there in the mythologies, and so these were ordered and very structured societies, which meant that individuals knew their roles. They were hierarchical societies. There was an elite from which the cacique, the leader, came, and he and his family lived in a different space, different type of housing, and they acquired wealth and so on. But at the same time, you get the sense that everything was shared out, that nobody, there was no want. Everyone had what they needed and knew their place. And there were um, people, like there were craftspeople. The women were the ones who tended the fields because yucca could only be handled by women from the start to the finish, the cassava bread, etc., etc., etc. So it just seemed to me that this was an ordered world where people knew their place, and there were people. I mean, I'm not suggesting it was perfect because um, I tried to show in the first part, the section with the villagers, that there were quarrels, there were misunderstandings, there were people who didn't fit in, just as we have in our world. It wasn't perfect in that sense, but people had rules to live by. And when you transgressed, there were people like the dark shaman, Sharktooth, who transgressed from the very beginning, sold his soul to the underground powers, which gave him power to enhance his own wealth, himself, and not to live for the good of society, which is what Candlo, the other shaman, is trained to do. So there are these contrasting elements there, but also in the Taíno world, there are always two sides to everything. So if you had good people, then you also would have had bad people, but the bad people would have been punished according to laws as well. So I was sort of trying to capture this, the way this world functioned too.
Is that where the idea of the two souls comes from? This the
Yeah,
duality of the spirits?
yeah, because there was no in this world there was no real division between the human, the spirit world, which would have been the world of the ancestors, and nature. Nature had spirit too, the way humans did. And so there was constant interaction between these worlds. It's very similar to, say, the Yoruba belief system, where you can harness power by you recognize the spirit world, and if you behave in a certain way and treat the spirits well, they will then enhance your power and look after you. So there's this, it's transactional, what goes on between all of these worlds. So, for instance, this is not in the novel, but the chroniclers noted that when a shaman, or when a carver wanted to carve an image of a spirit, he would go and first he would talk to the tree before cutting it down. He'd ask permission, and so that he, throughout that whole process of creation, the spirit would be involved, the respect would be there for spiritual values. And I think this permeates the entire world.
So you seem to have drawn on the creation story of the twins Boyanel and Marohu in creating Sharktooth's villain origin story. If this is so, what was it about that story that caught your attention to make you want to do that?
Yeah, the shark tooth's backstory was one of the last things in the book because he suddenly appeared. He appeared as a refugee and acquired more and more power in the village. And I said, "Who is this man? What is his backstory?" And so it sort of came to me the idea that he was one of twins and so on, simply because, again, the universe of the Taíno was based on this duality. They're always, everything is twinned, and of course, the twins you mentioned are the weather twins who live in a cave. And of course, they don't, one is rain and the other is sunshine, and they're constantly warring. So that is sort of symbolic. And so it just, once I saw Sharktooth as one of twins, it just seemed to work its way through the whole process of evoking twinship just seemed to work its way through. I mean, in writing a novel, because I knew much of the story, I knew the mythology, I really had tried to understand the society before I came to write it. A lot of the things that are in the book sort of just fell in place through, I guess, my unconscious knowledge. And I think that was one of them.
Could you say, well, one of the things that I observed is that there are all of these different ways power manifests, as I mentioned earlier. And we spoke about the power of naming, but there are other ways that power manifests uh, between, and I don't want to sort of create this dichotomy, but there is a way in which the Taino used power, sought power, deployed it, and the way the European invaders also used power. So if you could comment on that particular feature as well, please.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Deborah. Um, I think yes, power was used very differently because to me, the power of the Spaniards resided in their notion of racial superiority. They never saw the Taino as human. Um, and in fact, there had to be a debate in Spain to establish that fact. Not just the Taino, but the indigenous people of the Americas. And their power resided in that thought that they were superior. There was never any question in their minds that they were, and that they were sent to, but also their power resided in their weaponry, their superior weaponry, which included, we might add, not just um, swords and so on, but animals. Horses and dogs were used as weapons against indigenous people because they had never seen, they were not familiar. And of course, if you can imagine yourself being confronted for the first time by these animals, you can imagine how this would have been as threatening as somebody with a sword to have rabid dogs set on you, as they were in Jamaican, the first encounter there to subdue the native people. So to me, the Spanish power resided in their notion of racial superiority and their weaponry, and also the power of the word, the written word. People
El
have said it
libro.
was one of the weapons of conquest, and books have been written about this. But anyway, but it seems to me that indigenous power in indigenous society, power is negotiated. Um, there are people in the society who are more powerful than others through leadership. The cacique's word was law, but he didn't just jump up and acquire that power. It is his superiority is recognized because of whatever, however he arrives at that space. So there was power inherent in the leaders and also in the medicine men. So Candlewood in all of these societies, next to the cacique, the medicine man or the shaman was second in power because his power came from the semis, but from studying how to acquire power and how to utilize it on behalf of um, the community and so on. And then women had power, a different kind of power, which they used in other ways. So um, to me, as I said, I think power in indigenous communities is a matter of exchanges and reciprocity. And of course, absolute power resides in the gods, in the zemis, and that is also recognized. And every human then life is spent negotiating, with others in the community, but with the spirit world. How best to live your life so you do not offend. That you can be a good citizen, that you will be rewarded as necessary, or in some cases punished as necessary. So power is sort of conceptualized as something that's always circulating, as opposed to residing in the individual and the weaponry that he has, or in the state that sends people to take over lands belonging to others and so on.
In many ways, this seems like a David and Goliath story. Is that how you conceived it?
No, not at all. In writing the story, as I said, I assumed the point of view of the Taíno. So I wasn't really thinking, I wasn't conscious, let us put that way, of thinking of contemporary life or stories from the Western or civilization or the East or what have you. And I don't see this as a David and Goliath story, because that's a story about someone with very limited resources challenging someone much bigger in every way and winning. For me, the story here, the battle that is being won today with the indigenous people affirming themselves, what is it, over 500 years later, is through subterfuge. It's marinage. It's power. It's infiltrating the enemy and using maroon tactics to establish yourself. So it's a very opposite. It's sort of underground, subterranean type of challenge to authority, and I think this is something we're continuing to do today.
Yes, and the novel also points to the ways in which resistance and survival can coincide or come together.
Yeah.
Resistance, survival as a strategy of resistance, in the
Yes.
way the group came together after the disaster, Night Orchid, Heart of Palm, Seku, and the Behike. And I'm not remembering all of the names.
Split. Yeah.
Candlewood,
Yeah.
right? He basically charts the path forward for them, which I
Right.
see as survival being as a means of resistance.
Exactly. And this is the point I'm making, that it was underground all this time. It existed because people hid. Even today, there are people now in, say, Jamaica who say, we were always told we were Taino, but we were afraid to say it because people laughed at us, because we were told we were extinct. And so to me, that's the difference between the David and Goliath story and the story of survival through other means, through, you know, literally going into hiding.
And
But the,
survival as resistance.
yes, so yeah.
Because we do get this sense of loss when Maima is destroyed, and when Night Orchid, when she emerges and she learns that all of the women who would have ushered her into her womanhood right, through her womanhood rights and so on, and she's reflecting on all the other people that she lost. And it was more than just losing your kin. It's about losing the features of your culture, the aspects of your
Mhm.
heritage that make you, that cement you, as a person in that world.
Yeah. Hmm. And
Yeah, and mhm.
sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna ask for you. Well, you if you could comment on this sense of loss and how
Hmm.
I call it ontological erasure. But as you were just mentioning, there are people who are here who are reclaiming their Taíno heritage.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
that is just basically what
Yeah.
I was thinking about.
Well, the story is very sad. It's not just sad, it's harrowing if you read, what really happened. But at the same time, I didn't want to write a story that ended on a negative note. I wanted to write a story that said, yes, we are still here as people, with whether Taino, whether Africans, whatever, people who have survived so much, and yet we're very much here. And so I was always heading to that moment where people would begin to form a maroon society, which is a blend of all kinds of people. And so that was sort of deliberate on my part, the recreation of community, which was different from the Taino originally. It is now a multicultural society that is being created in the mountains and in maroon societies. And this is still the Caribbean today. There are very few people who can claim they are 100% anything, you know. Although we do know there are a lot more DNA showing that there are a lot more Taino people who can claim Taino, or more people who can claim Taino blood, because it's through the mother's line. You think about it. But yeah, I wanted to show the reformation of a community after the destruction of the original one in the village, because this also fits in with indigenous beliefs that the world was created and destroyed multiple times, you know. And I think we are going through a time, we might think of it as a time of destruction, but I'm hoping we'd also see it as creation arising from, out of destruction. So that was sort of deliberate on my part.
And is that also why the third person narrator tells a story of someone whose frame of reference, from the perspective of someone whose frame of reference is Taino cosmology?
Yes, yeah, very definitely. Or in the case of the African, I'm trying to refer back to his belief system and his. Well, I mean, what interests me, he is derived, his family from Africa, his great great whatever, his ancestry is griot in the family, who's a historian storyteller, and he brings a book that he's reading, which is, part of Western, how Westerners presented history. And then we have the Taino way of presenting oral history through their arietos, which are performed and where they keep adding. And so, to me, this represents the three worlds coming together, the black, white, and red, if you want to call it that,
I
in
thought
this moment in the Caribbean, which I find astonishing.
I thought that was so beautifully realized in this story, especially when Night Orchid, it's through Night Orchid's interaction with him that
Mhm.
he's then prompted to recall his own history of orality, the importance of the griot to his lineage on the continent, something that he had long forgotten.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess the final question would be, what is the next project we can expect from Sister Olive Senior?
I think I want to just sit in my garden and watch plants grow and watch birds. However, I do have a children's book coming out next year. I've been working on three books simultaneously. And so the third one it's a collection of my retelling of traditional tales, and I made up some stories. But the whole idea, it's part of a world series called um, Fairy Tale Feasts, because every story has a food in it, and there are child friendly recipes. So it's also a way of teaching about culture through food. And I'm still sort of working on aspects of that. So that will be out next year. And I think I deserve a rest. I don't know what my next project will be. But thanks for asking.
We look forward to it.
And thank you both. I really enjoyed this, and I loved your questions. And so,
Well,
so
thank you for giving us such an engaging work, as you could see. I have all the tags there. Thank you so much, Olive Senior to Olive Senior.
thank you,
Yes,
Deborah
it
and
really
Roger.
was our pleasure having you on our program. And our viewers who weren't privy to our conversation before would have would be happy to know that you've watched some of our other videos and totally
Yeah,
enjoyed them. So I
yes. I have
encourage
to
our
big you up. Big you up.
yes. So I encourage our viewers to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to watch our other videos, and to look out for this video as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a lovely day.